Good day, my name is Sarel van Grenen, coming to you all the way from South Africa, and today I would love to speak to you about factorizing trinomials. Now, trinomials, ladies and gents, are an expression that has three terms. So, an expression like a plus b minus c is also considered a trinomial. Although we were not going to look at that specific expression, we would like to look more at the expression like x squared minus 3x minus 4. Now, the whole thing about factorization is that we would like to break it up into brackets that we would use later on to solve equations. We would like to use it later on to work with quadratic functions and all of those things. But it's extremely important that before we get to those type of functions or those type of equations, quadratic equations, we must first learn to factorize. Now, factorizing, or in layman's terms, breaking it up into factors, is an extremely important part of algebra. Now, we can also look at expressions like 2x squared minus x minus 6 or 3x squared plus 7x plus 4. So there's a basic pattern that follows, or that you can see that forms with quadratic or trinomials, is that you would always have something that is a square, an x, and a constant. It could also be another variable, not just specifically x, but something like 3m squared plus 7m plus 4. I have seen in the past with all of my students, one of the most difficult things that students have is, how do I factorize an expression like that? Let's take one step back and ask ourselves, what is factorization? So factorization, ladies and gents, is basically finding expressions that goes into another expression, leaving a remainder of 0. Or in other words, it's in essence the reverse of product. So for instance, if I have x plus 2 and x minus 3, and I multiply it out, let's quickly do that by looking at the distributive property of mathematics, which says that in brackets like this, for us to multiply this out, you need to multiply everything of the first bracket into the back bracket. So I'm going to take the x and multiply it in by the x and the minus 3. So x times x gives me x squared. X times by minus 3 gives me negative 3x. If I now go to the 2 and I distribute the plus 2 into the brackets, then I'm going to have plus 2x and then minus 6. Which, if I add the right terms, is going to give me x squared minus x minus 6. Now that is what we call multiplying out or product. But our whole challenge is, how do I go from this expression where I've got x squared minus x minus 6 back to the brackets where I've got x plus 2 and x minus 3. Now that is what today's lesson is all about. Now there are many different ways. Personally, I know about 3 or 4 different ways. I would like to show you a way that I have seen worked over all the years that I've taught. So if I can rewrite this quickly, and I've got x squared minus x minus 6. This next method I'm going to show you is simply a variation of an older method that is commonly used in South Africa, where I come from, but it's a visual, amazing tool that I have seen my students and they've loved it because it always works out. So let's get started. This method is a very simple method, but requires that you first of all write your expression in descending powers of x. In other words, I have my x to the 2 that is written first, my x squared, then secondly my x, and lastly my constant. Then the next step would be to draw up a table that looks like that. I'm going to try now and put my x squared first, and I'm going to have my -6 written secondly. Your middle term, the one with an x to the power of 1, I'm going to put right at the back. So my -x. Very important, do not forget to take the negative with the x. And now here's where the amazing part starts. On the left-hand side of this column, I am going to multiply, while on the right-hand side, I am going to add. But what am I going to multiply? Let's first of all start with the x's. So which variable or numbers can I multiply to give me x squared? Well, I'm going to say x times by x, because x times by x gives me x squared. Next up, I'm going to go to the variable and ask myself, what times by what gives me a negative? Well, very easy, a minus times by a plus, or a positive times by a negative. I'm first of all going to have a look at multiplying a minus by a plus. Then lastly, I'm going to have a look at the 6 and ask myself, what times what gives me 6? Now, there are many different factors of 6 or factor pairs of 6. I could have 6 and 1 as well as 2 and 3. Now, as a basic rule of thumb, I like to go to the 2 and the 3. So let's see by multiplication if this thing works out. Well, let's try and saying, well, 3 times by 2. Because 3 times by 2 gives me 6. And now here's a very important part. Now this next part might for you feel a bit strange, but this is how the technique works, and I'll explain in later on this lesson why I have to do it like this. Now we have to cross multiply. So I'm going to take the x and times it by the 2 to give me 2x. Next up, I'm going to take that x and cross multiply it to the top. And x times by -3 gives me -3x. Now we get to the very important part. If I add up the -3 and the +2, does it give me the -x? Well, -3 plus 2 is -1x. So does it work out? Yes, it does. Then, these two expressions on the left are going to be my factors. So in other words, x squared minus x minus 6 is factorized into x minus 3 and into x plus 2. Well, ladies and gents, if we look right at the top, you can see that it is true that if I multiply these out, I get x squared minus x minus 6, which I got there. So this is a very easy and very basic, amazing tool for us to work with. I would love to give you one more example. So let's try it on a new slide. So let's have a look at trying to factorize x squared minus 5x plus 4. Let's try and factorize that. So I'm going to draw up my table, and I'm going to write my x squared first, my plus 4 second, and then lastly I'm going to write my -5x. So with regarding to this, now I've got to look again at the left-hand side and saying, okay, you know what? What times what gives me an x squared? X times by x. What times by what gives me a positive? Well, I can go a positive and a positive, or a negative and a negative. My students always ask me, but sir, how do I know? Well, this negative here at the end is a good indication that I'm going to rather use a negative times by a negative than a positive times by a positive. But let's quickly have a look. What are the factor pairs of 4? I can go 4 and 1 or 2 and 2. After a while, ladies and gents, you will get used to which one will work with which one and which ones won't work. So let's try and see. Well, 2 times by 2. That gives me 4. So let's cross multiply to see whether this works out or not. X times by negative 2 is negative 2x. X times by that negative 2 is negative 2x. And if I add them up, negative 2 times by negative 2, wait, whoa, let's stop there for a moment. That gives me negative 4x, not negative 5x. So let's try and see if 2 and 2 doesn't work out, well then I'm going to have to try something different. I'm going to have to try and see, but what if I change my left-hand side? So let's try 4 times by 1. So x times by negative 4 is negative 4x. X times by negative 1, that's negative 1x. And if I add them up, negative 4x minus 1x gives me negative 5x. Oh, fantastic. So this means my two factors are x minus 4 and x minus 1. And there I have factorized my trinomial. And the wonderful thing, ladies and gents, is that because of that, I have now factorized and I can do all trinomials, even ones where there are a 2 or a 3 or any kind of variable in front of the x squared. The only difference is that the moment that I go to my table, now I just do 2x squared there. And then I do my negative 3 there and my plus x there. And here I'm going to repeat the process, but I'm going to start now not just with the x squared, but with 2x squared. So I'm going to say 2 times 1 gives me 2. X times by x gives me x squared. Again, now I'm going to go over to my negative and ask myself, what times what gives me a negative? A negative times by a positive. Next up, I'm going to look at my factor pairs of 3. So I'm going to have a look at 3 times by 1 or 1 times by 3. So I'm going to go and say, well, let's try 3 times by 1. So let's cross multiply to check out whether this works or not. Well, 2x times by plus 1, that is plus 2x. And 1x times by negative 3, that's negative 3x. And if I add them up, plus 3x minus 3x plus 2x, ooh, again that doesn't work out. But minus 3x plus 2x is negative 1. I'm looking for plus 1. So with this rule of thumb, I can ask myself, why don't I simply swap the minus and the plus around? Let's see if that works out. Let's do a plus times by a minus. So if I do a plus times by a minus, then on the right hand side, I'm going to sit with 1x times by 3, which is plus 3x. And 2x times by negative 1 is negative 2x. And if I add them up, it gives me plus x. Fantastic! So even with this one, I now have my factors. So therefore, I'm going to have 2x plus 3 as my first bracket, and then x minus 1 as my last bracket. Now, as promised earlier, I said to you, I would explain to you why we actually have to cross multiply. So let's quickly recap and think, but what is factorization? Factorization is the opposite or the reverse of multiplication. In other words, if I multiply these two brackets out, 2x plus 3 and x minus 1, I have to get this expression, 2x squared plus x minus 3. So I have to get 2x squared plus x minus 3. So if I multiply this out, I'm again going to use the distributive property, which says I've got to times the 2x by the x and the 2x by the minus 1. But ladies and gents, that is exactly what we did there. 2x times by negative 1. And if I look at the last one where I say 3 times by x, well, ladies and gents, that's exactly what I did there. 3 times by x. And that is why we have to cross multiply in the previous method. So this is a very easy and simple and straightforward way of factorization. Not the only way, but an easy and straightforward way for you to be able to factorize any and all trinomials. For any further information or any further queries, you are more than welcome to get in contact with me. And it's been a privilege teaching you a bit about quadratic functions and about trinomials and how to factorize them. And I want to encourage you to, even with trigonometry or with strange expressions that are in that form of a square and a value, a power of 1 and a constant, you can use this method. Go and explore the world of mathematics and have fun. Try this method. It's been a privilege giving you this lesson. Have a wonderful day further.